Hi everyone, hoping that you all are well. Welcome back for our continuing discussion related to the Celtic diaspora, the disappearing Celtic diaspora, and its reappearance. We're going to be looking at 250 years of coastal slavery. In other words, we're going to be looking at the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade did not start with Africa. It started with the Barbary coast slave trade from the 1500s through the 1700s. The Barbary Coast slave trade served many purposes. One purpose was to extricate the brown people from Europe and to transplant them in other places, either as enslaved individuals or as reduced cost labor. We're going to be looking at who conducted the Barbary Coast slave trade, who was enslaved, how they were enslaved, where they were enslaved, and why they were enslaved. So let's start off with who was orchestrating this entire Barbary Coast slave trade. First of all, you had the North African entities orchestrating the overall process. You also had the British and the Dutch involved in enslaving their own people. You also had the Ottoman Empire. And so very specifically with respect to this enslaving dynamic, you had some individuals who were involved in this process that were claiming a victimized identity related to the Inquisition. And so those would be the Moriscos and the Moranos. You also have the Ottomans, the Turks. You have the Moors. You have the Mughals, all participating in this particular transatlantic slave trade. And so the different entities had different reasons, but ultimately they were able to come together as a confederacy to orchestrate this entire dynamic. So some individuals were taken from Europe and transplanted into Africa or Australia or the Americas. Historic UK offers an explanation of this entire dynamic with respect to the Barbary pirates and the English enslaved individuals. And what they offer is that for over 300 years, the coastlines of southwest England were at the mercy of the Barbary pirates. Now you will see the word pirates or pirateers and privateers used, and that is in order to alleviate the involved governments from being implicated in this entire dynamic. And so they indicate that the slavery took place on the north coast of Africa, mainly involving the ports of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. And so they had a very thriving slavery market going on, an Arab slave market going on in North Africa. And so these Barbary pirates were allowed to attack and plunder all of these country coastlines, and they were all up the English Channel, Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and they were raiding at will. And what this means is you had countries that were not protecting their borders. Now, the claim is that there was an inadequate naval deterrent in terms of the governments of the European countries. However, that is ludicrous. What you have here is an indication that in 1625, there was an indication in state papers that, quote, "The Turks are upon our coast. They take ships only to take the men to make slaves of them." There's also an indication that the Barbary pirates were raiding on land as well as the sea. So in August of 1625, it was indicated that they were capturing men, women, and children and taking them into slavery in Cornwall. So brazen were their actions that they would board the ships at Cornish ports, take the crews captive, and simply leave the ships empty and adrift. Now, what historians will have you believe is that this was what is known as a white slavery. And that's because of the depiction of Europe currently. So there's a stereotype of Europe, and that stereotype has been used to fuel this entire narrative. But these individuals who were enslaved in the Barbary Coast slave trade were a part of the transatlantic slave trade. And so you see here a report in 1640 indicated that there were some 3,000 to 5,000 English people that were in captivity in Algiers. And so you saw a number of individuals coming out of Cornwall and coming out of all of those isles. And so you had a couple of things at play here. You had a bunch of European countries wanting to rid themselves of their brown residents. And you had a number of individuals of an Arab persuasion who wanted slaves. And so this was all up and down the coast of West Africa. So you've got North Africa, and then you have all the coast of West Africa. And so these individuals, for many reasons, wanted enslaved individuals, and they were able to make an income out of this entire dynamic. But there was something else going on, because this slavery was a very selective slavery. And so everyone was not being enslaved and transplanted across the Atlantic. Everyone was not transplanted into what is now known as America. And so you had certain individuals going to different places, and there were strategies in place in some instances where they were intentionally separating families and sending one family member to Australia, another family member to the west coast of Africa, another family member to Virginia. And because the enslavers were primarily the Ottoman Empire, the Moors, the Mughals, because those were the primary enslavers, there was a narrative that attempted to situate those being enslaved as Christians and those being the enslavers as Islam. But there was more going on than that. So there was a purpose to removing certain people from Europe and transplanting them in other places. It was simply convenient for some groups to participate in this process. And there's also a dynamic where there is an equating of Christian with white, and then equating Ottoman or Moor or Turk with browner skin. You also see here where there's an indication that those who were kidnapped would be sent to slave markets for the Ottoman Empire. And so they could be bought as laborers, concubines, or pressed into these galleys. Some documentation comes from diaries, and you have individuals explaining their experiences having been enslaved, and also the brutality that was a part of the slavery process. And this text provides additional information related to this Barbary Coast slave trade and the use of human beings in commerce. It's very interesting that you have certain individuals who complain about human beings being used as a part of commerce. However, they are also taking great pride in being a part of the history of individuals who participated in this particular process of using human beings as a part of commerce. And so one thing that's indicated here is that while Europe was involved in this entire transatlantic slave trade process, that Elizabeth I had been perhaps sending shipments of artillery and ammunition to the Moors of Granada. And this was in an effort to oppose what was going on in Spain at the time. You also see this notation about these English and Dutch privateers who had previously aided the English war effort. Once they were released, they set sail for the Barbary Coast so that they could aid the Muslim pirate community. This then allowed the Barbary pirates to be transformed into what is indicated as an effective and threatening force employing modern sailing technology. Now, moving on to what constitutes or constituted this Ottoman Empire. You see the root of Otto, meaning wealth or prosperity. And it's also related to what is known as the East Frankish dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire. Ottoman is also understood as the branch of Turks which founded and ruled the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire role in this entire slavery dynamic expanded beyond Turkey. And as you recall, you have individuals who are on the west coast of Africa who are identified with Turkey. There is a relationship. You even see the relationship in terms of the language. And then you have also individuals in parts of Africa identifying according to Turkish or Ottoman titles, and Bey or Beg. Those are two of those titles, and those are either courtesy titles or titles of rulers or governors. You also see that these titles are associated with Persian ancestry along with the Turkish ancestry, and that this title is associated with the title Lord, and is also an honor title in princely families. And so you shouldn't be surprised to find this title being used by different individuals in Africa, whether North Africa or the west coast of Africa. And again, part of the reason there is a disconnect has to do with stereotypes related to phenotype. And so there's the expectation when you were talking about individuals in Asia or Eurasia that they will be lighter, and those on the west coast of Africa would be darker. However, those phenotypes have nothing to do with family lines, and family lines can be of a variety in terms of phenotype. We're just going to quickly look at some of these atypical dynamics with respect to the transatlantic slave trade coming from Africa into the Americas. And you see some anomalous dynamics here. So coming out of Ireland, you have ships starting in Ireland, transporting into Africa with these unspecified ports. You have no idea where these ships went to in Africa. It's not even clear that they went to Africa. However, we have them landing in the islands. So you see Barbados and Grenada and St. John. So they were coming out of Cork, Ireland, Dublin, and Limerick. And this is in the 1700s. You also have this odd dynamic of ships coming out of Glasgow, coming out of Scotland, going into a variety of places in Africa, and then eventually making their way into Virginia, Martinique, and Barbados. And this is the 1700s. And then this is a very interesting data set here. These ships are coming out of Plymouth, and they are going to unspecified ports in Africa or Sierra Leone, Calabar. Now, many of these ships are going in the 1500s and then finding their way to Colombia. What's interesting is that Sierra Leone did not exist in the 1500s. And you have even more ships coming out of London, transporting into Africa, and then going into all of these unspecified ports in Barbados, St. Kitts, Jamaica, Suriname. And here you see that odd dynamic of leaving Plymouth, London, going into these unspecified ports in Sierra Leone, 1500s, and then ending up in Hispaniola and in Colombia. And so while you will hear individuals purporting that this transatlantic slave trade involved white enslaved people, common sense will tell you that this did not involve primarily white enslaved people. It involved brown enslaved people being taken from Europe, taken into various places around the world, and primarily into the West. And what's interesting to note is that you have a number of people who are identified as brown people pushing this particular narrative. And just a reminder for those of you who may not have checked out the earlier discussion, this is out of Races and Peoples, the Science of Ethnography, 1901, talking about a description of the Celtic people. And this text indicates that the individuals who were enslaved in the sacking of Baltimore had a particular phenotype, and by and large you had individuals who've been described over and over in many texts as having a brunette complexion. They were dark. You also had individuals who had that stereotypical red hair, freckle dynamic. And so there was a phenotype that went along with most of these people that disappeared from the East Coast in what was known as the sacking of Baltimore. That is the big situation that many people know about. And this is just a reminder of that phenotype. And so when you have individuals who are pushing this narrative, it doesn't matter whether they are historians or other content creators, you need to challenge them about that. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't insist that the people were brown who were in those isles and then turn around and claim that the people who are enslaved from the isles were the lighter people when the lighter people remain there and the brown people are no longer there. This is another reminder of some of the individuals that were removed from these isles and from the various parts of Europe. And so this is from Wales, and you see the heraldry, including Bangor, David and Asaph and Landulph. As we wrap this up, we've looked at how the Celtic people have disappeared over time and the role of the Celtic enslavement in the transatlantic slave trade. We've looked at the relationship between the Celtic disappearances and the Barbary coast slave trade. We've looked at who conducted the transatlantic slave trade with respect to the Barbary coast portion of it, how individuals were enslaved, where they were enslaved, and why they were enslaved. One question to consider is why there is an investment in characterizing this enslavement as one primarily involving lighter skinned individuals and disconnecting it from the transatlantic slave trade when clearly it was completely connected. And so why are individuals, both light and dark, invested in this particular revisionist history? And while you may be familiar with some of the Psalms of David, you might want to check out some of the Psalms that are attributed to Asaph. And there are a few dynamics in the Psalms related to Asaph that appear to be related to the narratives of the Barbary Coast slave trade. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.